What if the Cold War never truly ended? What if the moment the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 did not mark the conclusion of a global conflict, but the beginning of a quieter phase of the same struggle? At first glance, the Cold War seems clearly defined. It began after World War II and ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It had two sides, two ideologies, and a series of well-known crises. But when we look at the structure it created, the alliances, the rivalries, and the logic of global power, it becomes harder to say that it truly disappeared. Instead, much of it still exists, embedded in the way the modern world operates. To understand this, we need to return to 1945. Europe was devastated, its cities destroyed, and economies shattered. Traditional powers such as Britain and France were weakened. Into this gap stepped two countries that had emerged stronger from the war, the United States and the Soviet Union. They had fought on the same side, but their cooperation had always been limited by deep differences. The United States promoted a system based on elections, political pluralism, and private enterprise. The Soviet Union followed a one-party model with centralized economic planning. Each side believed its system was not only correct, but necessary for stability and progress. This belief quickly turned into suspicion, and suspicion into rivalry. Between 1945 and 1949, Europe became divided. Western countries aligned with the United States, supported by economic aid and security guarantees. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet influence, with governments that followed Moscow's direction. This division was not only political, it was enforced by military presence and, in some cases, by force. The creation of NATO in 1949 formalized the Western alliance. It was a collective defense agreement, meaning that an attack on one member would be treated as an attack on all. In response, the Soviet Union consolidated its own bloc, later organizing it under the Warsaw Pact. The world was now structured around two opposing systems. At the center of this system was a constant question: which model would define the future? This was not simply a matter of ideology, it was about influence, territory, and security. Each side believed that the expansion of the other posed a direct threat. This created a cycle in which both increased their military capabilities and sought allies across the globe. Nuclear weapons intensified this competition. By the early 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had developed nuclear arsenals. Over time, these arsenals expanded dramatically. At their peak, the combined number of nuclear warheads exceeded tens of thousands. Many were far more powerful than the bombs used during World War II. This created a new form of deterrence. The concept was simple but severe. If one side launched a nuclear attack, the other would respond, and both would suffer catastrophic destruction. This principle, often described as mutually assured destruction, limited direct war between the superpowers. Instead, conflict shifted into indirect forms. The first major test of this system came in Korea. In 1950, war broke out between North and South Korea. The North was supported by communist allies, while the South received backing from the United States and its partners. The conflict was intense and destructive, with millions of casualties. It ended in 1953 with an armistice, not a peace treaty. The border remained heavily fortified and still exists today. A similar pattern appeared in Vietnam. What began as a struggle for national control became part of the larger Cold War framework. The United States supported South Vietnam, while North Vietnam was backed by communist states. The war lasted for years and had significant consequences both for Vietnam and for American society. It ended in 1975 with the unification of the country under a communist government. In the late 1970s, Afghanistan became another focal point. The Soviet Union intervened to support a government aligned with its interests. Resistance forces, supported by the United States and others, turned the conflict into a prolonged and costly war. The strain it placed on the Soviet Union was significant, both economically and politically. While these conflicts were fought in specific regions, they were connected by a broader pattern. The superpowers avoided direct confrontation, but competed through influence, support, and strategic positioning. This approach extended beyond military conflict. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. This event marked the beginning of the space race. It demonstrated technological capability and had strategic implications. The United States responded with increased investment in science and education. Over the following decade, both countries pursued major achievements in space. In 1969, the United States landed astronauts on the moon. This moment was widely seen as a demonstration of technological leadership. Yet the broader impact of the space race extended beyond symbolism. It contributed to the development of satellite systems, which now support communication, navigation, and weather forecasting. It also accelerated progress in computing and engineering. Despite the absence of direct war, there were moments when the risk of escalation was extremely high. The most serious occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. The United States responded with a naval blockade. For several days, both sides prepared for the possibility of nuclear conflict. A negotiated settlement was eventually reached. But the event demonstrated how close the world could come to disaster. By the 1980s, the balance that had defined the Cold War began to shift. The Soviet Union faced internal challenges. Its economy struggled to keep pace with Western economies. Central planning proved less effective in meeting the needs of its population. Military spending remained high, placing further strain on resources. Political reforms introduced during this period were intended to address these issues, but they also exposed deeper problems. In Eastern Europe, governments aligned with the Soviet Union began to lose control, public pressure for change increased, and reforms spread across the region. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, which had divided East and West Berlin for decades, was opened. This event symbolized the collapse of the division that had defined Europe during the Cold War. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, and 15 independent states emerged. For many observers, this marked the end of the Cold War. The United States remained as the dominant global power, and the ideological rivalry appeared to be resolved. However, this interpretation does not fully account for what followed. Some historians argue that the outcome reflected the strength of Western systems, emphasizing economic performance and political stability. Others point to internal weaknesses within the Soviet Union as the primary cause of its collapse. A third perspective highlights the role of individual decisions and leadership choices, suggesting that different outcomes were possible under different circumstances. These interpretations offer different explanations, but they all focus on the same result. What they do not fully address is how much of the Cold War structure remained in place after 1991. One of the earliest examples is NATO. Rather than dissolving after the end of its original rival, it continued to operate and expanded its membership. Countries that had once been part of the Soviet sphere joined the alliance. For these countries, membership provided security. For Russia, which emerged as the largest successor state in the Soviet Union, this expansion was viewed as a strategic concern. This difference in perspective has contributed to ongoing tensions in Europe. The Russo-Ukrainian War is one example, where questions of alignment, territory, and influence are closely tied to the legacy of the Cold War. Elsewhere, divisions created during the period remained unresolved. The Korean Peninsula is still divided between North Korea and South Korea. The absence of a formal peace agreement means that the conflict technically continues. The heavily fortified border reflects a situation that has changed very little since the early 1950s. In Asia, the rise of China adds another dimension. While China was part of the broader communist world during the Cold War, its current system combines state control with participation in global markets. Its relationship with the United States involves both competition and cooperation, reflecting a complex balance that echoes earlier patterns of rivalry. Another aspect that continues from the Cold War is the role of nuclear weapons. Although stockpiles have been reduced since their peak, thousands of warheads remain. They continue to influence strategic thinking and limit the likelihood of direct conflict between major powers. Less visible, but equally important, is the evolution of intelligence and influence. During the Cold War, espionage involved human agents and physical surveillance. Today, it often takes place in the digital domain, cyber operations, data collection, and information campaigns. These have become central tools. These methods differ in form, but they follow the same basic logic: seeking advantage without triggering open war. One lesser-known detail highlights the scale of the Cold War's legacy. At its peak, maintaining nuclear arsenals required not only advanced technology, but also constant readiness systems, including early warning networks and rapid response mechanisms. Many of these systems remain in place, adapted to modern conditions, but still rooted in Cold War planning. The Cold War also shaped economic institutions and global trade patterns. Organizations that expanded during that period continued to influence international finance and development. The spread of market-based systems accelerated after the Cold War, but the underlying competition between different models of governance did not disappear. When viewed in this way, the Cold War appears less like a discrete event and more like a framework. Its visible features, such as the division of Europe or the existence of the Soviet Union, have changed. But its underlying patterns, competition between major powers, reliance on alliances, and avoidance of direct conflict remain.